George, you've written this week about Rachel Reeves and whether she can avoid a fiscal crisis similar to those terrifying words, Liz Truss and the mini budget. Tell us about that.
Well, there's been a shift, I think, over the last month or so, really since the U-turn over the welfare cuts, which obviously cost the government $5 billion, and the OBR's report on the generally dire state of the public finances, which is that serious people, and in some cases people supportive or sympathetic to Labour, are beginning to wonder if we're heading for a real fiscal crisis. So I interviewed Gary Smith, the General Secretary of the GMB union this week. That's actually Rachel Reeves' own union. She spoke at their recent Congress, and he said the finances are very precarious, and this could unravel quite quickly. Helen Thompson, Professor of Political Economy at Cambridge, has said the UK now looks like one of the more vulnerable advanced economies and that we can't rule out a crisis in the near future. And the big picture is the UK's position is not good. As the OBR said, we have the 6th highest debt, 5th highest deficit and 3rd highest borrowing costs of the 38 OECD countries. And the bond markets are quite tolerant of governments that are indebted but have a clear plan to reduce their debts. They look at Labour, they see a government that's only 1 year old, that has a landslide Commons majority, and they think you couldn't get through the winter fuel cuts, you couldn't get through the disability benefit cuts. You say you're not going to raise any of the main taxes. Where exactly is the money coming from? And growth is shrinking.
Andrew, how worried are you about a Truss 2.0?
I am very worried. I think we are remarkably close to some kind of meltdown. I hate saying that, but I just think it's true. I've been talking to people as well, including Lord Wood, Stuart Wood, who was one of Gordon Brown's economic advisors when he was in the Treasury and has subsequently interviewed Rachel Reeves this week. He is really worried about this. I think the point George makes about the bond market is absolutely right. They are kind of hovering around all these stuttering Western economies, including Japan. By the way, they're looking at Japan very hard at the moment, and Japan also has big political problems, more so than we have. But they're looking at Britain with a particular skepticism because of Liz Truss. I mean, that is part of the terrible inheritance. The bond markets take Britain less seriously than they used to, and we have to have a higher bar. Rachel Reeves has to show that she is tougher than she would otherwise have been because of Liz Truss. But I think there is one other aspect to this which hasn't been much reported and really matters, which is we talk about the bond markets. We need to think a little bit more about who in the bond market is investing, because the tradition was you've got these great big, slightly stodgy, grey institutional investors buying British debt, and they would sit on the debt for a long time. It was part of their long-term portfolios. They didn't move very quickly. Now, that is now changing. Hedge funds are getting into the gilt markets, particularly the 10-year gilt markets. And in the early months of this year, the quantity of trade that was being done in those markets by hedgies had risen to about 60% or so. Now, that is worrying because hedge funds, unlike the institutional investors, if they don't like the look of something, dump very quickly. It produces more volatility, more uncertainty into the markets than we have known so far, which is, I'm afraid, a further reason to be very worried.
And obviously, you mentioned that Rachel Reeves has promised many, many, many times, the government has promised many times, that they're not going to raise those 3 main tax levers.
So she has to raise something, I'm sure. I think she'll look at things like the bank levy. I think she'll look at things like a gambling tax that Gordon Brown has suggested. But those are relatively small potatoes. I wonder whether she's not going to have to look at equalising taxation on investment income, capital gains tax with income tax. I think that's the big question going forward. She hasn't ruled it out. She hasn't ruled it in. But the other thing I think is that we are at a moment when public spending is also a problem. I think Keir Starmer is gearing up for a relatively reassuring, relatively normal kind of party conference speech in the autumn. I suggest this is a mistake. It may be a moment when he has to confront his party and the country about the need to tighten and control public spending more tightly, in sort of the way that Jim Callaghan famously did back in the 1970s when he told the Labour Party that, the option of increasing employment by ever greater public spending, I tell you in all candour, that option no longer exists. And when it did exist, it just produced more inflation. I think we need a kind of crunchy, slightly confrontational tone from the Prime Minister at party conference. Well,
you've brought up the 70s there. George, what do you reckon? Are we facing a sort of summer, winter of discontent style polycrisis when it comes to finances and public spending? And, just because Andrew has very much done the doom and gloom, it's all a disaster side, do you have any positivity for the Labour staffers who we know are listening to this podcast going into the summer to give them a bit of optimism and some ideas?
Well, look, when you ask cabinet ministers about this point, they don't deny that the bond markets are a concern and something you need to take seriously, but they also point out that UK debt auctions are still oversubscribed. They say there may be potential for growth to surprise on the upside. They point to the trade deals, which they think will have short-term and long-term benefits.
Yeah, we're signing one with India.
But I agree with Andrew that there's a split in a sense now between, it's less a left-right split, although on some issues it is, but it's a split between those who are muddling along in the hopes that something turns up and those are the more radicals in Labour who think the government needs to think big, make bigger choices about the state, look seriously at the role of the OBR and even the Bank of England, and look at fundamental reform of policy. I asked the Cabinet Minister recently, would you look at the triple lock, given the OBR report clearly flags that as a fiscal concern? You could use that as a starting point. And they basically said, we don't have a democratic mandate for that. So they very much think the manifesto stands. That's the Treasury line on tax as well. And the question is whether it will take a crisis for that to change. Until there's the Milton Friedman line. The actions taken in a crisis depend on the ideas lying around. And what you see at Labour from the Growth Group and others at the moment are more radical ideas bubbling up. And the question is, who in government, how many in government are prepared to latch onto them?
I think that's absolutely right. And just in the spirit of being a slightly greater optimist than I've been today, I think a lot of people in government would say, look at the sheer quantity of investment coming into the economy. It's more than it was in the New Labour years. And that as that investment comes in, people are going to spot sort of potholes being filled in. They're going to find out it's easier to get a doctor's appointment. They're going to see the waiting list in the hospitals coming down. They are going to notice stuff. And so the optimism is more about hanging on tight, gritting your teeth and waiting for the big investment to show its effects. In other words, we're not completely at the crisis yet. The bond markets might move on to France. France has got terrible problems in terms of its debt at the moment. They may look elsewhere. We keep our heads down, keep going forward and enjoy the summer, but not for too long.